Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that this is our last event of the autumn 2023 semester. Our next event will be announced in January. But tonight I'm delighted to introduce Jonathan Eig, who will be in conversation with Harvard's Professor Randall Kennedy. They will be discussing Eig's very stimulating new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. Eig's best-selling King, A Life is the first major biography in decades of the civil rights icon and the first to include recently declassified FBI files. Jonathan is also the author of the award-winning Ali, A Life. He has also written books about Jackie Robinson, Al Capone, and a history, The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution. He was trained as a journalist at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, where actually I, a long time ago, obtained a master's degree, so we have something there in common. Jonathan has worked as a news reporter in New Orleans, Chicago, Dallas, and elsewhere, but like many good journalists, he's graduated to writing biography. Randall Kennedy is a renowned legal scholar and a faculty member at Harvard Law School. He's written 7 books, including Interracial Intimacy, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption, Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word, Race, Crime, and the Law, Sell Out, The Politics of Racial Betrayal, The Persistence of the Color Line, For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law. His latest book is Say It Loud on Race, Law, History, and Culture. And I want to note that a few months ago, he appeared on Lex Friedman's long-form podcast to discuss the N-word. Randall is obviously not the kind of academic to shy away from controversy. Please look for all these books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Jonathan and Randall will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from our live audience. We will try to end this program after 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Professor Kennedy, you now have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and I'd like to thank all who've made this forum available to us. Jonathan, congratulations on your book. It's been widely reviewed, and it certainly has garnered a lot of praise. Let me kick off things by asking the following. So everybody in here, I bet, knows something about Martin Luther King Jr. What would you say to somebody who did not know anything about American history, did not know anything about Martin Luther King Jr.? If someone said, who was Martin Luther King Jr., what would you tell them?
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. I would say, pull up a chair. You're going to hear a story about this guy you've never heard of who believed, was thrown into a position of leadership that he did not seek and did not really want, and believed it was his responsibility because of the injustices that he faced and his people faced, and because of his belief in God, that he felt he had to do something about it, and took on that responsibility in spite of the fact that he didn't want to do it, he was afraid to do it, he suffered emotionally for it, and he ended up bearing the wrath of many of his own people and his own government, and kept going and kept doing this because he really believed in the words of God and in his duty to his responsibility to help his people.
Follow up, what were his major achievements?
I think he brought us closer than anyone in our history to actually fulfilling the promises of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. I think he led the movement that got us closer to overcoming the foundational sin of racism, the systemic racism that is built in and still built into our society. I think he and his movement got us closer and passed meaningful laws that got us closer and gave people a sense of hope that we could actually be a different country.
Okay. How did you choose this project? There are a lot of, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of projects, I'm sure, that were available to you. Why did you choose this one? And let me just say, I mean, it would seem to me to have been a particularly daunting subject. I mean, King has had several, first-class biographers, David Levering Lewis, David Garrow, and he is, a person who, well, there's a national holiday named after him. I mean, it's a person who's very well known. I would have thought that would have been a very daunting mission. How did you get to, what put the idea in your mind of writing a biography of this person who has been written about before?
I tried not to think about all those things.
Okay.
I was almost trying to, pretend that nobody had ever heard of this guy before and that we needed a biography that would introduce people to him for the first time. And there's a reason for that. And to answer your question literally, why I thought of this, how I thought of this, I was interviewing people for my Ali book, and they started talking about Martin Luther King. And I realized that a lot of them knew King. Specifically, the one who really triggered it for me was Dick Gregory. I was interviewing Gregory at a hotel in Washington, D.C., and I was asking him about the meetings between Ali and King, because they met twice, and they, of course, disagreed on a lot. King, of course, was pushing for integration, and Ali thought integration was a waste of time. He was part of a separatist black nationalist group, and they agreed over the Vietnam War. And what Dick Gregory told me was that the men just fell in love with each other, that they really just felt this great, they both had a fantastic sense of humor. Ali loved to tease King, even though he hardly knew him. And Dick Gregory said to me, he said, the difference between Martin Luther King and Jesus? And it's Dick Gregory, of course, so I'm thinking this is a joke, so I just waited for the punchline. And he said, the difference is that we have videotape of Martin Luther King. And I thought, I'm still puzzling that one, but I thought, we have more than videotape. We have people like you who knew him, who hung out with him, who weren't just like witnesses, but people who were close friends. And I just immediately felt like I should spend the next few years, at least, just traveling the country, interviewing people who knew Martin Luther King, just getting them on record one last time, recording them with just my little tape recorder. If not, I wasn't even sure at first whether I wanted to write a book. Then I went and looked to see what the books that were on the shelf about King. The last straightforward biography was Stephen Oates in 1982. I don't count Garrow's book as a biography. David Levering Lewis's book came out in the early 70s. And I don't count the Taylor Branch trilogy as a biography either. Those are much broader in scope than a biography. And Taylor Branch and David Garrow and David Levering, those two who I've spoken to don't refer to their books as biographies either. So I immediately saw that we needed a more intimate portrait of King, because the Garrow books and the Taylor Branch books are these broad histories. And I felt like King, in the time since those books were published, has been turned into a national holiday and a monument, and we've lost sight of him as a human being. So I immediately wanted to see if I could write something more intimate, in part using these interviews, hundreds of people still alive who knew King, people who knew him very well, and new FBI documents, new archived documents at the Schomburg from SCLC's official historian, just thousands of pages of documents that weren't there when Garrow and Taylor Branch were doing their work.
You talked about interviewing people. I think that one of the most impressive aspects of your book is your care in dealing with oral history. In particular, your attentiveness to the way in which, memory is a funny thing. especially, if you're talking with somebody 30 years after the fact, they've seen the way that history's gone, everybody wants to be with a winner. And over and over and over again, you talk about the way in which people's memories have changed over time. So, for instance, you talk about Rosa Parks and, that great evening when she refused to move from the bus. But you point out that she had varying, remembrances of that occasion. How do you deal with the problem of memory and tainted memory in particular?
There's no easy way to deal with that. Journalism 101 is if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Thank you, Lillian. And the truth is, people's memories change. They tend to exaggerate as they're older. The people who live the longest get to tell the most lies. And there are people who have been telling these stories over and over. But what's interesting about Rosa Parks, I found this great collection of papers. I think I'm only the second author to use them. Fisk University sent sociologists to the Montgomery bus boycott as soon as it started. And they began interviewing everybody in sight. The folks walking instead of riding the buses, the bus drivers, they interviewed Klan members. They sent white and black sociologists down there. And if they happened to overhear a conversation in a diner, they would file a report on it. And they interviewed Rosa Parks before anyone else. And she told the story very differently of her arrest. And she of course, said she knew she might get arrested. This was not an accident. But she also said that she did not intentionally choose a seat that she thought would provoke a fight. She just she took this, and then she began to tell the story a little differently. And that just happens over and over, and the longer folks live. My other favorite story, and I think Taylor Branch was the first to write this, is that Mahalia Jackson inspired I Have a Dream. Mm-hmm. The story goes, and it's been repeated over and over and over, that the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington speech wasn't going very well. It was a little dry. The crowd wasn't feeling it. And Mahalia Jackson, who was sitting right in front of King, shouted out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," as if to say, knock off this boring stuff and do what you're good at. Give us a sermon. And then King pivoted and started the dream speech. And that's been reported in books over and over and over again. And I was skeptical about it. And I managed to find a copy of the Motown master recording of the I Have a Dream speech, because Motown was planning to make a record, which they never did for legal reasons. But on that master recording, you can hear Mahalia say, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," after he's already gone in to the I Have a Dream portion of the speech. So she's basically echoing him. It's not "Tell him about the dream, Martin," it's "Tell him about the dream, Martin," yes. And that's the kind of stuff that just, you just got to be on alert for it. But I'm sure I didn't catch every example of that kind of exaggeration.
What was the biggest surprise in your research?
I'd have to say the biggest surprise was just how depressed King was. And this is ironic that the FBI transcripts, which were, the FBI was surveilling him and recording him in a hope to really destroy him and to break him, it ends up humanizing him for us now when we read these transcripts 60 some odd years later, because you can see how much he's suffering. You can read the transcripts of these phone calls where he's on the phone with his closest friends, people he loves and trusts, and they don't understand what he's going through. They don't understand why he's continuing to speak out on the Vietnam War, why he's speaking out on Northern racism. They keep saying to him, these are people like Bayard Rustin, Stan Levison, they're saying, chill out, just stick to voting rights. Just do what you're good at. This Vietnam stuff is causing you nothing but suffering, and it's hurting our fundraising. Is it really necessary? And you can read King's response. You can read his response, and it's heartbreaking. He's having to say to his closest friends, don't you know me? This is not about what's politically expedient. This is about what's morally right. And the thought that he still has to explain that is just crushing. And he just sounds really unhappy in those last years. And we've got a lot of his phone calls. It's not as if we're just getting the bad ones. We've got everything.
In your view, what was King's finest hour?
His finest hour?
Yeah.
Might be the Riverside Church speech, exactly a year before his assassination, April 4th, 1967. And this is at a time when he's under attack. the news media has turned on him, and let's remember that part of the reason the news media has turned on him is because the FBI has been leaking the sex tapes to members of the media. That they're not writing the story about his sex life, but they all know about it. And that's partly why he's subject to more criticism when he speaks out on issues beyond segregation. They feel like, you don't know what you're talking about, you're a hypocrite. And he's getting battered, and yet he goes to Riverside Church and gives the speech that really summarizes all of his Christian values and all of his concerns about the future of America. And he says that, he's opposed to war, not just because we're killing our fellow humans because we're all brothers, but also because the whole military-industrial complex is causing a rot in the soul of America, that it's changing who we are and what we care about as a people. And this beautiful speech, this brave speech, is just panned in the press the next day. Times, Washington Post, everybody pans it. And I think it's his finest moment because he's not getting any points for it, but he's standing up for what he believes in.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you emphasize that, because and one of the things that comes through in your book is how the people who were closest to him were really so much against him on this. I mean, it's one thing for people to be, defiant in the face of enemies. I mean, that takes bravery sometimes, but I mean, you know they're enemies. But here was a case in which everybody who was closest to him, particularly Bayard Rustin, was really just, they were saying, you're wrong to do this. And yet he did it.
Yeah, he was getting no love, and it's not like Stokely Carmichael or any of those guys were coming to his cause. He was really alone, and he felt it, and he was deeply depressed. Not just like, I'm not using that word loosely. I think he was, Jesse Jackson told me he thought he was clinically depressed, and some of his friends actually, and we hear this on the tapes too. His friends were talking about, how can we get him out of here? Can we get him to take a teaching job in Europe for a year? We need to save him, because he's not going to hold up under this pressure much longer. And some of his friends actually had him meet with a psychiatrist to talk about maybe trying some medication, and he wouldn't do it because he was afraid the FBI would find out.
What do you think was his lowest moment? So you just told us the moment that you think is most praiseworthy. What's the moment that is most worthy of condemnation in King's life, in your view?
That's a tough one. Obviously, we could talk about his womanizing, but if we stick to the public stage, if we stick to the public king, I think his wishy-washiness in Selma was a dark moment, was an unfortunate moment. I think people were counting on him. People came from all over the country to walk across that bridge, and he was really flip-flopping until the very last minute, and then he did flip-flop. He compromised. Instead of marching across the bridge, he stopped and knelt for a prayer, and I think he disappointed a lot of his most loyal followers there. It's not a guy who you can often accuse of lacking courage, but I think he was really torn between taking the risk physically of violence, seeing other people injured, and also defying a court order and upsetting the Kennedy administration. I think it's one of those rare moments where he backed down.
Yeah. Well, there was a good legal reason for him to back down.
Counselor, tell us.
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, he was facing a court order, and it's sort of interesting thing. Throughout his life, throughout his career, he was facing court orders, and at various points had to decide if he was going to defy the court. And of course, one of the times when he did defy the court, the case went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and he lost 5-4. And it's a very famous case. Another thing that's so nice about your book, and it's a nice big book. Nice big.
My editor is here, and he did not make me cut it, so thank you to Alex.
You talk about the people around King, And, you know, the people around King have gotten a lot of attention over the years, but I must say, in your pages, they came alive for me more than, you know, in their own biographies. You know, again, I'm thinking especially of Rustin, but others as well. Who would you, in your view, who was the most impressive of King's associates? And, you know, what I have in mind is, well, his wife, Rustin, this guy Levison, Andy Young. I mean, he had a bunch of very impressive associates. In your view, who was the most impressive of his associates?
Well, let me, before I answer that question, say that we raised this point backstage, and Kai and you and I were talking about some people feel like biography is not as serious as other kinds of academic books because we focus too much on one person and we don't explain the movement. But I think biography also presents an opportunity to highlight some of those people whose stories are not going to be told. We're not likely to see a giant Ralph Abernathy book, but this is an opportunity to tell you about Ralph Abernathy in a really important way and help you better understand the role he played, and maybe it will lead to a Ralph Abernathy book down the road. Certainly, you know, for Bayard Rustin, but I think most importantly for me in this book, Coretta Scott King was the person I most wanted to shine some light on, because she suffered, but she was so misunderstood. She's seen as the woman behind the man, and that's a familiar cliche. She was so much more, and she was constantly pushing him intellectually, challenging him to do more. We think about, you know, and I've mentioned several times that King felt like it wasn't enough to do civil rights, that he had to explore human rights. And Coretta was saying that from the day they met. And when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, it's Coretta who says, we have a greater responsibility than ever now to broaden our scope and to talk about world affairs. And the reason Martin Luther King fell in love with Coretta was because she was smart and she had more experience as an activist than he did at the point that they met. And I really wanted to, and she has not had a good biography. I really wanted to use this book to make people more aware of just how important she was.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. I'm sure that folks have questions. My last question, at least in this round, is going to be, well, two things. First, a comment on your last point about biography. I think it's so strange that in some precincts of academia, biography is downgraded. It seems to me it's the perfect setting for, on the one hand, the particularity of a human life. I mean, every human life, you know, we're weird. Everybody's weird in some sort of way. So in biography, you get to focus on an individual and talk about the way in which an individual encounters society. It seems to me that biography would be the perfect place to, you know, to sort of excavate social life. But end of that.
I'll let that go.
Who are your favorite biographers?
Wow, we've got a lineup here at the Levy Center. I'm a big fan of T.J. Stiles. I'm a big fan of, more popularly, Laura Hillenbrand. I think Laura Hillenbrand is the person who kind of inspired me to try writing a biography, because I read Seabiscuit and I just thought it was so compelling, so smart, and it was something that could reach a massive audience, and I think that appealed to me. I don't think I'd ever considered biography until I just saw how she did it and sort of deconstructed it. And because I'm a huge sports fan, that appealed to me too. And for me, like writing the first biography, my first biography was a baseball book, you know, Lou Gehrig. It really helped me overcome some of the fear of attempting a biography, because sports has so much structure to it. The seasons give you structure. The action in the field gives you structure. So I grew up reading nothing but baseball books as a kid. And I think the idea that I could maybe learn to write a baseball biography just took some of the fear away for me.
Okay. Questions, comments, objections from the audience? Oh, how do you many handle this?
I have a mic somewhere. I think we're pretty small. I can just shout. Aside from the kind of bundle of things people often say about King, that he was courageous, he was brave, he had convictions, what do you think are the other sort of virtues of King as a political
As a what? I'm sorry. I didn't.
As a political
As a
leader?
political leader, he was not a great organizer, you know. And this, I'm going to answer. I'm going to tell you some of the negative things first, which accentuate his greatness. He was not a great organizer. He was not a great manager. He was afraid of conflict. He hated conflict. Our greatest protest leader hated conflict, something deeply rooted from his relationship with his father, I think. And yet, he was willing to do these things that he knew were not his strength because they were the right thing to do. And over and over again, he was willing to throw himself into chaotic situations in the belief that something good would come out of it. And if you think about all his greatest successes, they're not situations that he planned or prepared for. Montgomery bus boycott, he's thrust into a position of leadership with no plan whatsoever. And Birmingham, it's a complete failure. It's supposed to be designed in response to his previous failures in Albany and St. Augustine. He goes to Birmingham thinking he's learned something, and Birmingham fails too. And it's not until he's improvising and asks students, the young people of Birmingham, to begin joining the campaign, and Bull Connor reacts by putting the dogs and the fire hoses on. That's when the movement begins to turn around. So over and over again, King is willing to embrace the chaos, to use Zora Neale Hurston's phrase, to make a way out of no way. And that's his greatest genius, I think. And it's just that improvisation. And at the same time, and you could talk about this, he's improvising, but he's also thinking about the long-term strategy, thinking about law. He's thinking about legislation. So there's a purpose to this. I think he sees himself as his job is to shine a light on racism, and that if he shines the light bright enough, people will see it and they'll have to do something about it. And that's where the courts, that's where the NAACP, that's where legislation comes in.
Just a footnote on what you just said. Let me read you the very first sentence of this wonderful book. On December 5th, 1955, a young black man became one of America's founding fathers. And then ... you go on to quote King's first speech as a civil rights leader. Now, he makes a speech when he's 26 years old, and it's extemporaneous. And it is a great speech, and it's especially a speech that speaks to, it really resonates with lawyers. I'll read 3 lines. He's speaking to a crowd that's so large they can't get into the church. They have speakers outside at the Holt Street Baptist Church. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And then he proceeds. 26, an extemporaneous speech. In my view, this was one of his greatest speeches. And over and over and over again, in terms of just rhetoric, if you were to write an anthology of dissent, dissent in the modern world, you would have to put Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And if you were going to write an anthology about great American speeches, you would have to put I Have a Dream. Again, and we're talking about a young person. He was killed when he was 39 years old.
That's right.
Really, just extraordinary.
And the blueprint for his whole career is in that first speech on December 5th, 1955. Because what's he doing? Talking about rhetoric, right? He is calling on the Bible and the Constitution to say racism is wrong. He's not saying we're going to burn this country down. He's saying we want to join this country because we think the Bible and the Constitution are right. So he comes up with this message that's almost impossible to resist. And that's why it resonates beyond just the walls of that church and out in the street, but all over America, because it makes people think, how am I going to argue with that?
Others? Yes.
I was an activist in the 70s and 80s, and in my mind, it's very difficult to separate Dr. King from his counterpart, Malcolm X, who had a big impact on my generation. I have a hypothetical. that amongst movement people, it was often thought that had Malcolm not been shot down in '65, that maybe the two leaders would have reached a closer sort of view of American society. And I'm talking about two things. The U.S. as an imperial power exercising its military force as a neo-colonial power, and then also questioning the very structures of capitalism. And I don't want to bring Malcolm in. I once had the honor of, as a young radio reporter, interviewing Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. But I think that conversation sort of planted a seed in my mind about that hypothetical. Did you see Dr. King maybe really going after those two sort of pillars?
I think there's no question that they were both moving in similar directions, and that there's no telling what would have happened had they lived. Obviously, that's partly why they were assassinated, because the government saw them as threats. And I'm not saying the government assassinated them, I'm just saying the government saw them as threats. But I will say, just as an anecdote, that in my research, I went to get the research, the interview that King did with Alex Haley. This was the longest interview Martin Luther King ever gave, and it's a famous interview in part because he criticizes Malcolm X. And he says Malcolm's incessant, fiery oratory is bringing nothing but pain to the black community. He's dividing us unnecessarily, and the transcripts of those interviews show that King never said that. Alex Haley changed the quotes, and what King actually said was, I don't think I have all the answers. I disagree with him when he promotes violence, but I think we have a lot to talk about. So even the media had an interest in dividing King and Malcolm.
Why would Alex Haley do that?
Excuse me?
Why would Alex Haley do that?
Why would Alex Haley do that? Because he thought we don't know for sure. My speculation is that he and his editors thought it would be more controversial, and that controversy sells magazines. The interesting thing is that King never complained about being misquoted. I guess as he was just too busy to even notice it.
Yes.
Okay, question. Would you care to comment on how responsible J. Edgar Hoover was for Martin Luther King's death? And then you don't speculate in the book about James Earl Ray and who might have financed him if other people were involved, because Hoover, according to the Beverly Gage biography, had a pattern of basically finding somebody, he did the crime, we'll move on now, because he didn't want to risk the FBI reputation?
So I certainly assign plenty of blame to J. Edgar Hoover. He set out to destroy King's life. He did a good job of damaging King's credibility, his reputation, and succeeded in many ways in dividing and helping to conquer much of the civil rights work that was going on. I don't see any evidence that he directly had anything to do with the assassination. We do know for a fact that the FBI published a memo just months before the assassination saying that now that Malcolm's dead, King is the biggest threat, and we should do everything possible to disrupt his activities and to make sure he's not successful in becoming the Black Messiah who leads a movement that forces us to change who we are as a country. That memo went out to every bureau office. I don't see, and I did not immerse myself in the conspiracy theories, but I didn't see anything to make me think that the FBI's fingerprints were on that assassination in any way. Yeah, the FBI made clear where they knew which hotel room he was going to be in, and newspapers published the details of that. The FBI intentionally made it known that he had stayed at a white hotel last time to embarrass him, and that's partly why he checked into the Lorraine Motel. So that's part of the conspiracy theories focus on that too, that it's possible that they wanted him there where he'd be more vulnerable, but that's speculation.
Have you encountered much blowback from readers who object to your discussion of King's infidelity to his wife? You write very early in the book, this book seeks to recover the real man from the gray mist of hagiography. And throughout the book, you very candidly discuss things which I would suppose would be, pretty hurtful to King's children, to King's relatives, to the people who really idolized King.
Yeah.
Well, what about all of that? Have you gotten pushback from people in those ranks? And what were you thinking in terms of how much you were going to reveal? I mean, you reveal a lot.
Yeah.
I suppose had you wanted to, you could have been even more particular. How did you, come to a decision on how much to reveal?
There's no simple answer to that. It's a gut check. I wanted to keep it to a minimum. I did not want to wallow in it. There are some writers who have wallowed in it, and I think I wanted to make clear that he was human, that he was flawed. I wanted to be honest. If I'm not honest with my readers, they're not going to trust me when I extol his greatness. I also felt like it was important to show you that he was flawed, in part because the FBI was weaponizing those flaws. So it would be very difficult to ignore it entirely. But I tried to keep it to a minimum, and there are certainly many things I left out, especially in the last year of his life. You'll notice when you read the last chapter that I don't mention his infidelities at all, because I'm trying to create a certain mood and I'm trying to keep you focused on what's important, and I don't think the infidelities matter at that point anymore. And at the same
Can I
time...
interrupt for 1 second,
Yeah.
though? Why? I mean, you point out that King continued to have extramarital affairs even after he knew that the FBI was tapping his home, was tapping his hotel rooms, even after he knew that he was making himself, and therefore his movement, vulnerable. Question, against that backdrop, why did he continue? What's your speculation?
I've talked to people about it. I've talked to people who knew him and knew that what he was doing, and they said partly he couldn't stop. He needed it. It was a way of him coping with the stresses of his life. And partly it was that it was like an FU to the FBI. Like, I know you're listening. Screw it. I'm not going to change. This is what I'm doing. This is who I am. You want to ruin me, ruin me. Interestingly, Andrew Young called me after the book came out and said he'd just finished it, and that he thought that I handled the sex stuff really sensitively and responsibly, and it was all true. He knew what was going on. He knew the women involved. He said, in particular, Dorothy Cotton, who everybody, all the previous biographers of King knew about Dorothy Cotton and her relationship with King, but they had not written about it while she was alive to protect her privacy. And I'm not the first person to write about her, but I'm the first person to write about it in context and to put some flesh on the bone and to explain what that relationship was really like. And Andrew Young said she was the greatest source of peace that he had, that she was just so comforting and so loving and so warm that no one could really calm him and help him get over the hard times better than she did. And I thought it had to be in the book if you want to understand what he was really going through.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Sorry, I tipped over my water. You mentioned that King was 26 whenever he first really started his activism. And I feel like we've seen a lot of activism from the younger generations in the past couple of years, but not really a lot of progress. Is there any ideas or concepts or way to organize that activists can use today that maybe we're forgetting that King was using to promote progress?
That's a great question, and I appreciate that. And I had lunch today with 8 Episcopal priests who were discussing this very same question, like, what can we learn from King to help us with the migrant crisis, for example, what can we do to help people realize that this requires community activism in a way that goes beyond clicking like on a post? And we didn't come up with any answers, but I think what helps us in remembering King and his work is that he was seeking the broadest possible audience. He was not speaking to the choir, literally. He was not speaking to the people he knew he could count on. He knew he could count on the church members in the South, but his message was meant to be heard by everybody, by black and white, North and South. It was meant to challenge, and certainly the letter from Birmingham jail is a great example of that. It was meant to challenge the preachers who should have been on his side and who weren't, the cowards as he viewed them, who were among, or the white liberals who were still on the fence, who were, happy to write a check to support the SCLC as they were, moving to the suburbs to get away from black families moving in. He was trying to reach all of them, and I think that's rare today, and I don't know how we do it, but we need to find ways to speak across channels, not just to the people who are following and liking us on social media.
Piggybacking on that, there's a term that some activists deride, if not denounce today, respectability politics. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a strong and seems to me totally admirable proponent of respectability politics. Again, going back to the Montgomery bus boycott, I think one of the most striking aspects of the Montgomery bus boycott is what Martin Luther King does when they call off the boycott when they have prevailed. So the Supreme Court strikes down the Alabama law, and King and company say, okay, we're going to go on the buses, you can sit anywhere you want. But on that first morning, King mimeographs a flyer that he gives to the people on the buses. And it's a flyer in which he says, good for us, we've triumphed, and this is a great moment, we should appreciate it. But let's be careful, let's stay nonviolent, let's not gloat. He says, anybody who can't do this, continue to stay off the buses. But he's 26 years old, and he has the it was just, what graciousness. And that's one of the things that made it very difficult for his adversaries. He was so big, he was so gracious, he was absolutely talking to, everyone. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that was one of the hidden powers of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can call it respectability politics. You can also call it, a morality play, because what he's basically saying is we are a repressed minority group. We can seize the upper hand. We can do kind of a moral jujitsu by showing that we are morally superior to our oppressors. And that's part of the nonviolent practice for him. It's a way of saying, you may have more guns and you may have more police dogs and you may have more people, but we have the moral authority here, and suddenly that takes away the power of the oppressor.
Others? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk. I see Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as a hugely influential figure in the world, and think of him as a human rights leader, not merely a civil rights leader. That's just my impression. But I would like to ask you the question, with the advantage of hindsight, we see that in his short life, Reverend King did change his objectives. At a certain point, it looks like he realized that he had inspired enough people and had actually ended legal segregation in the United States. At that point, he became focused on economic injustice broadly and poor people and the issue of poverty in this country. As well, he became very interested in peace, and he was very much in opposition to the military-industrial complex. It looks, with the benefit of hindsight, that he made this transition towards the end of his short life. So my question to you is, can you help us, or help me in an analytical way, what were the interest groups in America at the time who may have felt threatened by Reverend King's broader focus on these issues of poverty and economic injustice and militarism and the influence of military in America and in the world? Which interest groups may have been threatened by this, please?
Oh, that's a great question. I think King, first of all, let me say, he was interested in all those issues throughout his career because they were rooted in the Bible, and he was focused on integration and on voter registration in the early years because that was where he was gaining the most traction. But even in those early years, even in the 50s and early 60s, when he traveled to the North to raise money, he was calling out economic inequality. He was calling out northern school segregation, saying, it's just as bad up here. You're just hiding it better. He didn't really have the bandwidth to address those things until, as you pointed out, he accomplished these great things with voter registration and with civil rights legislation. And then he began to turn his focus toward calling out those injustices, to moving to Chicago and calling out the school and residential segregation there. And that's where I think you start to see people realizing this is a threat. You can, again, read the transcripts and actually listen to the tapes of Mayor Daley of Chicago on the phone with LBJ talking about the threat this poses to them and their power structure. You can certainly see how J. Edgar Hoover sees King's growing interest in economic inequality as a huge threat. He's planning the Poor People's Campaign in the last months of his life. And J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ, too, are terrified about this because they see the potential for a broader movement that goes beyond the black community and envelops all different races and classes, and the anti-war movement might fall into it. So they see this as a threat to the status quo, and I think that certainly the military-industrial complex sees this as a threat. So I think the answer is a lot of the white power structure sees King's more expansive view as a direct threat to their hold on power.
Here's your question.
Oh, you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in King's relationships with certain politicians and one particular religious leader. I believe Nixon got to know him in Ghana at the Ghanan independence, and they had some kind of correspondence or some kind of relationship, and I'd like to see if you could talk about that a little bit. And as far as Kennedy and Johnson goes, could you talk about particularly the tensions between Kennedy and Johnson and King? And finally, I'm interested in his relationship with Abraham Joshua Heschel and what that might say more broadly about Jewish attitudes, Jewish leadership attitudes towards the civil rights movement, and also what Reverend King's attitudes were towards the Jewish community.
All right, I'll try to do all three of those. As far, if I don't forget what the first one was already.
Was Nixon.
King really, I think, when he first met Nixon, admired him, and Nixon seemed to be progressive on race, and then over and over, King was disappointed by him, that he wouldn't put his money where his mouth was, and that he I think King, and he says in one letter that he thinks he's a hypocrite, and that was after, what seemed like a pretty good start in their relationship. And as far as LBJ, again, like disappointment. It starts out as a fantastic relationship, and we can hear the phone calls because Johnson was taping most of them. When he takes office right after the assassination, King is one of the first people he calls, and he's talking to him as a friend. He's calling him Martin and saying, "I'm going to need your help. You tell me what you need, but I'm going to need your help. We're going to pass the legislation that Kennedy proposed, but we're going to go beyond that. There's so much we can do economically together to help, get at the roots of some of these problems." You can hear them on the phone when there's the uprisings in Los Angeles, and King flies there to try to help, and Kennedy is so appreciative. And then you can see that relationship just souring. And why? It's in part because King is speaking out more on the Vietnam War, but it's also hugely attributable to the fact that J. Edgar Hoover is sending LBJ the transcripts of King's phone calls with women. And LBJ seems to be enjoying them. and encouraging Hoover to send more. And the president is encouraging Hoover to leak this stuff to the press. So that relationship really is hugely damaged by Hoover and the FBI. And as for Heschel, King really appreciated the support of the Jewish community, just as he appreciated the support of other religious communities. As I mentioned earlier, he felt like a lot of religious leaders were chicken, and that they weren't willing to stand up for what the Bible called for them to stand up for, but he was very appreciative of all the Jewish leaders who came and marched by his side. Heschel was a hugely important teacher, and Heschel is the one who said that he believed Martin Luther King was an American prophet, and since Heschel wrote the book on the Hebrew prophets, I think he was qualified as a judge.
Were there tensions as well, not necessarily between Heschel and King, but more broadly speaking?
No, I don't think there were any real tensions. I think King called out the northern hypocrites who sent him money but didn't really want to do anything, and that was not just the Jews in the suburbs of the north, that was everybody. So I don't think there were any particular tensions with the Jewish community.
Hey,
Hi.
can you talk a little bit about your process of getting people who knew King to give you information for your book, and just asking them if they would talk to you and things like that?
Well, as you know, I'm very friendly, and I'm a very good listener. And I called, it was especially hard with the famous people. You call Andrew Young, and he's done a million interviews, and why should I do another one? So it's hard for me to convince people like that to give me time. But once I do convince them, and I'm very persistent, I generally get people to give me some attention, give me some time. And I was very lucky that I began before COVID. So I was able to travel the country and meet a lot of these people in person. And then, and also my favorite interviews were with the people who weren't famous. His barber in Montgomery, or his childhood friend, June Dobbs Butts. And these folks hadn't been interviewed a million times, and they loved telling stories about old ML, as they called him. And when COVID hit, it was actually a blessing in a way, because a lot of these old folks were stuck at home and they had nothing much to do. And Reverend James Lawson, who was teaching a class in Los Angeles on nonviolence, couldn't teach his class anymore. And I said, "What time was your class?" He said, "It was 7 o'clock on Monday nights." I said, "I'm going to call you every Monday night at 7 o'clock. And you can just talk about whatever you want to talk about." And I did. I called him every Monday for, a couple of months. And June Dobbs Butts, I called her sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. So I loved the interview part of the process. I'm an old school journalist like your mom, and that's what I love to do.
Yes.
David Blight, in his biography of Frederick Douglass, starts out at the very beginning recounting an event at the U.S. Capitol. I think maybe they were installing a Frederick Douglass statue, and conservative Republicans are wearing a button that says, "Frederick Douglass was a Republican!" And his point is that Frederick Douglass was co-opted and sanitized. To what extent is Dr. King still, or in our current day, sanitized and co-opted, whether by conservative Republicans or other?
King has been hugely co-opted. He's been used and abused, and we have intentionally watered down his message. And that's something that Harry Belafonte talked to me about a lot. He was so angry that, as he's put it, we only love dead radicals in this country, and that King has been neutered. We've taken "I Have a Dream," and we've taught that, and we stop there pretty much. We teach that he, said we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, and people use that to say that King would be opposed to affirmative action. So over and over, we see this hypocritical, really vile attempts to cover certain people's racism by quoting Dr. King. They feel like they can use him for cover as they announce their opposition to policies that they know King would not oppose.
2 footnotes, if one takes a look at 1776, the Trump administration's answer to the 1619 Project. Martin Luther King Jr. is all through there.
I was afraid of that.
And is embraced by President Trump. Let me read a sentence, actually even, in a way, even more damning, more insidious than co-optation, might be just simple ignorance. This is on the last page of your book, and I think it's one of the most sobering things that you wrote. Quote, "On my most recent visit to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., in the spring of 2022, I found none of King's books for sale in the gift shop." Comment.
Let me say something positive. A park ranger read my book, went to his supervisor, and there are now King's books for sale in the gift shop.
Good. Yes.
You talked about many of the adversarial situations in which he found himself, and normal people would have just folded their tent and gone home. So, what was the source of his fire? What was the fundamental source of the drive that kept him going?
I think it was the Bible. I think it was Jesus. I was with the Bishop of Washington, D.C., and she said, "I love it when a white Jewish journalist says that." It was Jesus. I think that he felt like he would be a hypocrite. And he always said over and over again, "I'm a preacher. I'm not an activist. I'm in this because I'm a preacher." And that meant that he couldn't turn his back. He couldn't stop. He couldn't, as his friends were urging him, take a year off and do a year in Italy, or, Biarritz or wherever people go to unwind, right? He just couldn't. It didn't conform with who he was, how he saw himself as a human being. And that's powerful, because most of us would find a way to justify it. Well, I'll be more useful if I take some time off. If I let someone else lead, we might be better off. He just couldn't do it.
On the question of Vietnam,
Yeah.
I mean, many of his closest colleagues said, listen, what about our people here?
That's right.
Our people here are still engaged in this struggle. And King, yeah, our people here are still engaged in this struggle. And I just was reading this, magazine, and I saw these peasants in Vietnam being napalmed.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, he was
And they're God's people too.
they are God's people too.
Yeah.
And that is really, that was there with him. Yes, sir.
When King died in April of '68, at that same time, there was raging a fight for the Democratic nomination for president. You had three candidates, McCarthy and Kennedy, who were anti-war candidates, one a little later than the other, coming to the anti-war position, and Humphrey. Did they try to enlist King's support in that race, and did he have any views?
Well, LBJ certainly thought that Kennedy had enlisted King's support. LBJ thought that King and Kennedy were conspiring against him, and that was one of the many, paranoid, dark thoughts that LBJ was going through at the time. King really tried to remain nonpartisan, and for the most part succeeded in that. I don't think there was anything. You may know more than I do. I don't think there were any official connections.
Yes. Go ahead.
I was wondering if the book has changed you in any way, and if so, what has its impact been on you?
As a journalist, I hate talking about myself, but I would say that it has made me think more about our responsibilities. I'm a somewhat religious person. I think of myself as a somewhat moral person. And what are we doing to try to make the world more fair? What are we doing now that, what can we all do to help? If King could sacrifice as much as he did, it's made me reflect on my own role and why we're here in a deeply, spiritual way that I am very uncomfortable talking about.
One more.
I wanted to revisit the young woman's comment tonight about the pressure about,
Can you speak up?
I wanted to revisit the comment about moral high ground, and one of the things that I took away from the book was, thank you. One of the things that I took away from the book was exactly that he was an example of someone who, regardless of some of the examples where he may have flip-flopped or wasn't sure of himself in those moments, in general, you can claim that he was definitely not looking for an aggressive approach to outcomes. And I see today a through line. The example that I often look at is Michelle Obama, who says, we'll take the high ground when they take the low ground. What other examples can we look to of a direct through line to leaders today to give us that sort of encouragement?
Well, I think we see a lot of leaders today who are really devoting their lives to these causes, and I don't need to name them. They're, countless people. I think the problem today is it's just harder for them to get attention. We are living in a much more divided society, and I guess I'll go back to what I said earlier. The king power that might help us most is his openness to speaking to people who didn't want to hear him speak, in trying to reach the broadest audience possible. And part of that comes from not being so dogmatic, not being so set in your ways, being open to listening. One of my favorite stories in the book is when King goes down to Mississippi. He almost never goes to Mississippi because even for him, it's scary. And yet he goes down there after James Meredith is shot, and he and Stokely Carmichael are walking together through Mississippi. And Carmichael has always been somewhat skeptical of King. He sees him as being a fuddy-duddy and too conservative and afraid to really, embrace the idea of black power. And yet King is engaging with him and having these debates, and not in a defensive way, and not like, hey, I'm Martin Luther King, stand back, just listen, I have some. No, it's like this great dialogue. And at one point, Carmichael says something to him like, well, I'm using you, right? Like, by presenting you as the conservative, I get more cred as the badass. And King just laughs and goes, yeah, that's okay. I've been used before. And yet, if you watch King in the days and weeks afterward, he doesn't say black power. And he says to Carmichael, I'm never going to say it because it hints of violence. And I'm not even going to hint of proving violence. But he starts using black instead of Negro a lot more. And he starts using the word power, especially economic power, a lot more. So he's listening to Carmichael. He's absorbing. So I think it's rare today to find leaders who are willing to listen to their opponents and to embrace some of their ideas and to work across lines. And that's something that we can, I think, take from King's story.
Jonathan Eig, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for their generous support of this event. Good night, everyone.
Great. We should do this more often. That was great.